This is an overview of repetitive loss properties and the requirements under CRS. More information is available at crsresources.org. In today's training module, we're going to be talking about sections 501 through 505 in the CRS Coordinator's Manual. The current Coordinator's Manual is a 2017 version. Our objectives today are going to be to understand why the CRS requires a community to address its repetitive loss properties and how to determine and describe those repetitive loss areas. Notice we talk about how a community must address repetitive loss properties and how a community must determine repetitive loss areas. There is a very important distinction here between the properties and the areas. In sections 501 through 505 of the CRS Coordinator's Manual, we dedicate the discussion to repetitive loss. Here you will find relevant discussions on repetitive loss data and a community's responsibility to protect the data and CRS program requirements specific to a community's repetitive loss problem. We also cover how to define repetitive loss areas and provide guidance on outreach efforts to those defined areas. Section 501 opens the section with information on the community's repetitive loss list, and we do spend some time talking about the Privacy Act, which I'll discuss in greater detail shortly. Section 502 is dedicated to a community's repetitive loss category and how that category ties into CRS participation requirements. Section 503 begins the discussions of repetitive loss areas and how to define or identify those repetitive loss areas. Section 504 provides guidance on the outreach requirements of the CRS program if a community has any repetitive loss properties at all. And then Section 505 wraps up the discussion with information on repetitive loss mitigation activities. Let's talk about repetitive loss as it relates specifically to the community rating system. Under the CRS program, we use the original repetitive loss definition that goes back to the beginning of the National Flood Insurance Program. Under that original definition, a repetitive loss property is any property that has had two claims greater than $1,000 in any 10-year period since 1978. Does this mean if you had two losses and the last loss was in 1988 that it moves off your list? No, it does not. Any property that reaches this definition of two claims greater than $1,000 within any 10-year period going back to 1978 will remain a repetitive loss property until it is either mitigated by being retrofitted or until it is no longer in existence. A severe repetitive loss property is any property that is an RL property or repetitive loss that has four claims greater than $5,000 or two or more claims that are greater than the building's value. Within the universe of repetitive loss properties, severe repetitive loss properties are a subset. Under the National Flood Insurance Program, there are currently approximately 160,000 repetitive loss properties. Approximately 70,000 of those properties are currently insured. There are about 10,000 insured severe repetitive loss properties. Historically, repetitive loss properties represent 1.3% of all NFIP policies. 1.3% may sound low, but repetitive loss properties represent between 15 and 20% of all NFIP claims. Repetitive loss properties get special attention under the Community Rating System program because although they are a small number of properties, they represent a much higher proportion of claims. Let's talk about the repetitive loss list. ISO receives community-specific repetitive loss data from FEMA annually and distributes that data to CRS participating communities. The timing may vary based on the time it takes to receive the list from FEMA, prepare it for distribution, and then send it out to the communities that have repetitive loss properties in our program. If you need your list in between CRS applications or CRS visits, you would ask your ISO specialist for the data. They will give you the most current data that ISO has. The data remains considered the most current data until ISO is provided an updated list from FEMA. It is okay to use quote-unquote old data because there are typically minimal changes from year to year unless there is a major disaster event. If you have a disaster event, keep in mind that it does take time for that list to catch up with all the claims that are resulting from that disaster event. Following a disaster event, you would want to wait 6 to 8 weeks minimum before you would start to see changes in that list. If you are not under a cycle or you are not a new application, you do have to ask your FEMA regional office or your state for the data. It isn't because ISO doesn't want to provide it to you, it is simply that we don't have access to it. ISO is only provided the data for communities enrolled or seeking enrollment in the CRS program. The annual data distribution includes a great complement of information. Communities receive repetitive loss data in Microsoft Excel files and the AW501 worksheets in PDF format. The AW501 worksheets are divided into two different PDF files. One will be the unmitigated repetitive loss properties, and the other PDF file will be the mitigated properties. The Excel files will include the active policies information and a file called simply Historic Claims. This is a list of all claims that have ever been filed on the community's CID number, which is your 6-digit FEMA number. With the Historic Claims file, please keep in mind that you do not need to go in and evaluate and update that file because it cannot be changed. You can simply note for your purposes if there are claims there that are no longer in your jurisdiction, but it cannot be edited. Let's take a few moments to talk about the Privacy Act. With the data you will be provided comes a bright yellow Privacy Act placard. The Privacy Act applies to any insurance data, including repetitive loss data, which has personally identifiable information such as the address of the insured properties. If you need to move this data among the various departments within your community, you may do so. The data comes to you password protected. You should continue to leave it as password protected. You may share it within the departments of your community for planning purposes only, but make sure you keep it intact with the password. The Privacy Act determines how we work with data. The repetitive loss data is FEMA data. It is protected and may not be shared even though it is being used by the local government or state. When you see charts or spreadsheets such as this in your repetitive loss data, it is connected to the repetitive loss data and it is protected because it has address information paired with policy and claim information. Here are some examples of mapping repetitive loss properties and how you should go about displaying that information when you decide to go into the mapping activity. You are discouraged from denoting specific properties with any symbol, such as a star. Instead, you will want to map and number the areas. The boundary method is preferred. When you receive your RL data, it is going to come in an encrypted email that is password protected. If you save this to media, we encourage you to mark or label it as containing personally identifiable information. Put the disclaimer on it that it is for internal use only, protected by the Privacy Act of 1974. You can keep it in a drawer, which should be locked if possible. Again, we encourage you to maintain the password that is provided to you as access to those digital files. When you receive your RL data, we ask that you do several things. If you are currently undergoing a CRS cycle, then you are required to do these things. You should first review each property that is shown as an unmitigated RL property. Remember, you will receive 2 PDF files. Make sure that the property has a correct address, that it is indeed within your community, and that there were actually claims from 2 different flood events. When I say make sure there were actually 2 floods, if you look on your AW501 form for the date of losses, if you see 2 dates that are within 30 days of each other, then you may be looking at claims for the same event. If that is the case, you would want to pull the AW501 and send it in. We will have an evaluation done on whether or not that is the same event or 2 separate events. We will contact the agent for that property and make that determination. If it is the same event, then it may be that it has not triggered the RL status yet. There is another contractor with FEMA that can go behind the scenes and make the adjustment, so this particular property, if appropriate, will no longer be considered RL. You want to make sure it has the correct address. The address is literally the key to everything with management of these repetitive loss properties. Something as simple as having 12345 Memory Lane, LANE, or 12345 Memory Lane, LN, could cause you to have 2 separate AW501s for the same property. We call that a duplicate listing. If you look toward the bottom of the form, item number 6 is where you would report a duplicate listing for correction. This will reduce your number of RL properties by 1 by combining 2 identical listings. This happens frequently with things such as abbreviated addresses or the change from a rural route address to a 911 address. So pay very close attention if you have some older properties that have rural route addresses on them, and double check that they are not duplicate listings. We can fix that for you. If you've had any properties that have been mitigated, then you'll notice on the AW501 down at the bottom there are comments. There are places on this form for you to report if there is no longer a building on that property or if the building has been flood protected by some means. That includes the building having been replaced with a new compliant building. If there is no building, there are instructions in your packet on what you need to provide. Also, if flood protection has been provided, there is a list of documentation that you need to provide to support whatever needs to be done on that AW501. When you get your list, you need to review the list. It is required when you are undergoing a cycle, and it is strongly suggested if you are in between cycles. Cycles happen every 3 to 5 years. We strongly encourage you to keep that list updated in between cycles simply because it makes your task much easier when it comes time for a full cycle evaluation to occur. So make sure you correct and update any AW501s that you need to. Regardless if you have one update to make or if you have several, you only need one transmittal sheet. I would also like to emphasize again that we encourage communities to keep their lists updated every year, even though updates are only required when we come to visit you for a cycle. If you have a large number of properties on your list that need updating, perhaps you review those in batches. This may make the task easier for you throughout the year and definitely easier for you at cycle time. Once they have been reviewed and approved, you will be notified by the reviewer. They may also contact you if further information is needed, or if any of your updates could not be approved, they will notify you as to why. During your cycle visit, you are going to be asked to update your list and then fill out what we call the CCRL form. This is a form signed by the coordinator. It does not need to be signed by the CEO. This form confirms with your specialist that you have submitted any corrected or updated AW501s and sent them in with your transmittal sheet. If there are no changes to your repetitive loss list, this is your opportunity to tell your specialist that you have no updates to submit for this cycle visit. Section 502 begins the discussion of repetitive loss category. After you have reviewed your list and made any of the necessary corrections that you may need to make, we will then determine for CRS purposes what category you are. A community is considered a Category A CRS community if you have no repetitive loss properties. You could have never had any RL properties and you still have 0, or you could have had 10 and they've all been mitigated and now you have 0 unmitigated properties. In either scenario, the community would still be considered a Category A. A community is considered a Category B if they have between 1 and 49 unmitigated repetitive loss properties. If there are 50 or more repetitive loss properties, the community is considered a repetitive loss Category C. What do these categories mean? After correcting and updating your AW501s, if you find you're an RL Category A, which means you have no repetitive loss properties, you are free and clear. You have no further requirements under this particular section of the CRS program. If after correcting and updating your AW501s you have between 1 and 49 unmitigated repetitive loss properties, we consider you an RL Category B community, and this is a list of tasks that CRS is going to require that you do. You will need to prepare a map of your repetitive loss areas, and you will need to review and describe the RL problems for each of the defined areas. You will need to prepare a list of the addresses of all properties with insurable buildings in those defined areas. Remember, though, if it's a vacant property, we are not interested in it. Only the properties that have insurable buildings need to be listed. You are also required to undertake an annual outreach project to the addresses you determine are within your defined area. For those communities that have 50 or more repetitive loss properties, and that is a good number of communities within our program, there is one additional requirement. You must have credit in Activity 510, either with a creditable hazard mitigation plan or a repetitive loss area analysis. Let's talk a little bit about effective dates and when the repetitive loss category changes in conjunction with a change in the number of repetitive loss properties. Your repetitive loss category will change under the following circumstances: when we credit Activity 510 or when we modify you for a class increase if you need or want to change your class in between cycles, or when it is time for your cycle visit. So if a category changes outside of those three specific occurrences, you are not penalized and required to do anything more either until you ask for a change to add 510 or your cycle visit comes up. We see most of the changes in categories after major disaster events because that is when claims are generated. However, communities can rest and let things settle down between those events unless they specifically tell us they want to change or it is time for us to come see you for a cycle. When your ISO specialist comes to see you, what are you going to need to give them? You're going to need to give them any AW501s that need to be updated, the signed CCRL form that says you've evaluated your list, the map of your RL areas, a description of the cause of flooding, the list of addresses within the defined repetitive loss areas, and the number of buildings in each of your mapped areas, and an annual outreach project to those addresses. If you are a new Category B or C community and you want to change your outreach, or you've initiated your annual outreach for the first time, I strongly encourage you to draft your outreach and send that draft to your ISO specialist for review before you distribute it to your community. We have had instances where the outreach was sent to 1,000+ people with missing information required for CRS credit. Please work with your specialist very closely. They are there to help you. They can also give you pointers on formatting. We've been talking about mapping repetitive loss areas, and I called your attention to the difference between repetitive loss properties and repetitive loss areas in the very beginning because I wanted you to remember that. We have a guidance document available for you on this topic at www.crsresources.org. As you create your mapping product, be cognizant of the Privacy Act previously discussed. Specifically, general or aggregate information not connected to a particular property may be public. As we guide you through arriving at your repetitive loss area, remember that some of the information used to map the area cannot be shown on the map. The first thing you need to do for your mapping is look at where your repetitive loss properties are. Plot those on a map to get started. In this example, you see the 5 repetitive loss properties that are noted with the red dots. The next thing you want to do is look at your historic claims that are near the properties that are considered repetitive loss. These are listed in your Historic Claims Excel file. You would take this information and then add to the RL properties to get a better idea of where all the losses are occurring. If you have the capability, then I would encourage you to overlay a topo map in GIS to identify low areas or areas where the topo is significantly changing. Then draw a line around those areas with properties having either the same elevation or a history of flood claims. In this case, you can see we have isolated just one finger that is experiencing repetitive loss problems. You would then want to go and look at any other areas and try to determine why this one finger is experiencing losses and the others are not. The topo map would most likely show you that the elevations on this particular piece of land are substantially lower than that of other fingers that you see there. These folks are experiencing losses and the others are not. The properties outside of the defined area could very well be another topographically low area, or it could be an isolated stormwater problem. This is where you actually have to get up from your desk and go out in the field and put your eyes on it to see exactly what is going on there. When you go in the field, you're going to see if the buildings on FEMA's list might be unique. For example, only the ones that are slab on grade are experiencing losses. Perhaps the others are elevated on piers or pilings. In this case, we are looking to see where the stormwater flows. Perhaps because the two properties are in the path of that stormwater as it is gathering from other directions and being funneled out to the canal, and perhaps they're at a low elevation, the stormwater is collecting and causing flood damage before it moves. That would be my assumption, but you never know what you will find until you go out and do the field work. When you go out in the field, you are quite likely to see something like this. 3717 has clearly had some fill brought in, and it is significantly higher than 3713. That might be the reason why 3713 is experiencing more claims. This photo demonstrates why a field visit helps you confirm that the boundaries you draw actually make sense. Again, it is up to you to determine what your causes of losses are. That is not something that ISO can directly help you with. It is unique to each individual community and the areas you define. Are there remote ways to determine the boundary? There could be. You can contact your property owners and perhaps they can help you figure out why you have this one isolated property. When you talk to that property owner, perhaps this is an example of what you might find. Clearly, this is a problem unique to this property. Here you would have an area of one property. There is no substitute for going out into the field to see what you can see, and also contacting property owners to see what they have to say. Sometimes property owners have just acquired the property, and they may not be aware that there were losses, in which case your contact is a good heads-up for them. If there is only one building in an area, then you need to document why and use those large dots. How do you work within the parameters of the Privacy Act when you truly have an isolated property? You simply make a large dot. Remove the underlying coding that shows where the actual repetitive loss property is, and just use the dot. Here are some more examples of ways communities have found to define their repetitive loss areas. In this example, you can see that to the right there are 3 buildings just outside of the SFHA. These buildings are within the same block but are not experiencing the same loss. This shows how fieldwork can help you be more discreet in your definition of your repetitive loss area boundaries. These properties will not need to receive the repetitive loss outreach. If you are a community with hundreds or even thousands of repetitive loss properties, think of the savings that could be realized by ensuring a very precisely defined area receives the required outreach. Here is an example of another way to show your repetitive loss areas. We do give communities a lot of latitude within the parameters of their individual GIS system to provide products that meet the intent of the requirement in the manual. Just because you see it a specific way in the manual does not mean that's how you have to do it. It is simply an example. In some cases, you may find that your repetitive loss properties are spread all throughout your community. If that is the case for you, and this is something similar to what you see on your individual repetitive loss mapping efforts, then you can declare your entire community or your entire floodplain to be a repetitive loss area. We do leave that to you, but it is an acceptable method. We see this most commonly on some of the coastal communities or barrier islands, or others that are just off the coast and are relatively small communities. This is the choice that they will make because defining areas here is really not feasible. It truly is the entire community that is their area. Just remember, as you map your areas, the map the public sees must not show any individual properties that are on FEMA's repetitive loss list. You could prepare a list of addresses of all the improved parcels in the designated areas, and that is also private. Just to recap, at each visit for CRS cycles, Category B and C communities must undertake the mapping, describe the repetitive loss flooding issues, provide a list of addresses and number of buildings per defined area, and conduct the outreach. Keeping in mind that this exercise is required at each cycle and outreach is required annually, I will reiterate that it is to your advantage to keep your repetitive loss properties updated between cycles each time we provide an update to the repetitive loss data. Section 504 provides direction regarding the repetitive loss area outreach project. A Category B or C community must send out a notice with 4 key points. It must say or tell the property owner or recipient that the property is in or near an area subject to flooding. It must explain property protection measures that are appropriate for the type of flooding identified for the area. It must cover sources of financial assistance that might be available. Lastly, it must include basic facts about flood insurance. This is an excerpt from a sample outreach. This one was done in letter format, and this is included in your CRS Coordinator's Manual, Section 504, page 500-11. Your ISO CRS Specialist is a valuable resource and can help you decide how to best accomplish this requirement. For some examples of repetitive loss mitigation activities, please reference page 500-12 and 13 of your CRS Coordinator's Manual. Here are some potential sources of financial assistance if your community participates in grant programs. If your community does not offer or participate in any grant program, then at a minimum, your repetitive loss outreach to your repetitive loss areas does need to talk about increased cost of compliance. In summary, FEMA's repetitive loss information for your community is protected by the Privacy Act and not for public distribution. You do need to map your repetitive loss areas, and when doing so, ensure that you do not show any of the individual properties. You must provide a description of the cause of flooding in each repetitive loss area, and outreach must be conducted to those areas annually, and you must provide us with a list of addresses. Thank you for watching. Additional information on this topic can be found on the 500 tab at crsresources.org or by contacting your ISO CRS specialist.